When your closest ally turns into your greatest threat, survival stops being about revenge. It becomes about rewriting the rules. I used to think betrayal came slowly, a hairline crack you noticed only when light hit it just so. That was how I pictured it for other people, an affair that slipped into the margins of a marriage, a business partner's cold spreadsheet that replaced warm words. For me, betrayal arrived in the middle of a Tuesday, wearing the suit I'd helped pick out. My name is Kate. I'm 42, married for 15 years to a man who still opens jars for me despite the fact that I can do it myself. I have two kids who think the height of parental embarrassment is showing up at a school recital with the wrong shoes. I work in a field where discretion is currency and reputation is a currency exchange with a volatile market, consulting, leadership development, long-term contracts that smell faintly of coffee and handshake polish. I have been good at my work for a long time, competent, relentless, the kind of person who read contracts for pleasure because words meant order to me. I rose by doing right things at the right time and by keeping a stubborn sense of fairness. Laura and I built an empire of late-night emails and dry white wine at conferences. She was 3 years younger, but older in the way she walked into a room and rearranged the air. We met at a client's retreat, two women who hated small talk and loved frameworks, and we became allies the way soldiers become allies, through shared hardship, constant proximity, and the mutual exchange of hard-won secrets. We were each other's emergency contact for career decisions and, oddly, for life. When my mother was ill, Laura insisted on taking over one of my workshops and refused to accept my apologies. When Laura's marriage frayed, I took the kids for a weekend and returned with 2 toothbrushes and a casserole dish. We were the kind of colleagues who made reference calls for each other like a benediction. I trusted her with things I didn't trust anyone else with: numbers, strategies, even the bone-deep dread that comes at 3 in the morning when a client calls your name and you cannot get out of bed. The company where we both worked was ridiculous in its smallness and grandness. It fit into a corner room that smelled like lemon cleaner and the personal ambition of 6 people. We were mid-sized enough to have clients that mattered, and small enough that a single spreadsheet could topple careers. I loved its instability in a secret, practical way. There was always room to maneuver, to build, to be useful. Laura and I had been architects of several of those maneuvers. We brainstormed product lines on napkins, negotiated contracts from the backs of cabs, and argued about efficiency metrics until someone called a truce and suggested we get lunch. None of this makes what happened less humiliating. It does, ironically, make it more reasonable, because you can't steal from someone you don't trust. Trust is an economy that a lifetime of small favors compounds into a capital fund. I'd invested everything in Laura. I gave her my drafts and my drafts of my drafts. I sent her my rough proposals with comments and margins full of exasperated questions. I told her things I told no one, that I was tired of climbing and wanted to be remembered for the work, not for how tired I looked while doing it. She listened. She smiled. She took my words and, like all good listeners, used them. On that Tuesday, I found an email that someone meant to keep invisible. It wasn't dramatic at first, no fireworks, no confession. A file name, a subject line, a forwarded message with my handwriting in the margins, my handwriting that I used only on internal documents because I liked the tactile feeling of pen on paper. I'd been hunting for a contract clause, looking for a client file before a meeting, when a folder opened on my screen with Laura's login still active because she'd been at lunch and I needed something urgent. Human error. I still tell myself that, though human error tastes like ash now. The email was a negotiation plan addressed to a competitor, not to a client. It referenced a proposal I'd been developing for months, our intellectual late night, the idea of a subscription model for long-term organizational coaching. It quoted passages I had drafted in a doc I shared privately with Laura. It proposed a way to undercut our own pricing structure. It suggested that my role would be minimized in the public-facing materials. There were numbers and timelines, and at the end, signatures that weren't inked but implied, a courtesy bow to the world, arranged offstage. I felt my body fold into a way of being I had not given permission to embody. There was a small, clinical part of me that cataloged everything: date, time, recipients, because that is what I do. The rest of me wanted to throw the laptop out the window or run to the nearest women's restroom and scream until my throat raw. Instead, I closed the folder and put my hands around a pen until the knuckles whitened. Betrayal is not a single feeling. It is betrayal plus the knowledge that you chose to believe, that someone you let in with both keys took the spare and walked out. The rest of the day, I moved like a person in a painting. There were meetings where my answers were precise, my posture impeccable. I made jokes. People said, "Kate, are you okay?" And I lied with the gentleness of long practice. I kept the email in my head like a splinter, turning it at odd angles. When I walked home, I told myself the plausible deniabilities. Maybe Laura had felt pressured. Maybe she'd been trying to secure the firm and made a selfish choice. Maybe it wasn't betrayal as much as survival. At home, my husband noticed before my words formed into sentences. He has always been a reader of faces. He reads mine like chapters. "You're holding something," he said, in the quiet way that meant he was offering to hold it with me. I wanted to throw myself into his arms and let my body do the shaking it needed to. Instead, I asked for more time. I told him I'd been at an exhausting client lunch. He believed me because he wanted to. He still wanted to. That night, I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. Betrayal does odd things. It pulls you backward and forward at the same time. I began to reckon that this was not just about us at the tiny office or about an idea I had hoped to incubate. It was about the currency of trust one had built out of years, and the way a single act could fracture more than a career. My sense of who I was, the tidy map I used to navigate human relationships. I decided, in that long, small hour, that I would not move like a person shattered. I would not howl. I would not run. The thing I had been, the professional who measured risk and consequence, asserted itself. I would find the facts. I would not be cheapened by spectacle. If there was to be justice or revenge, I would make sure it was guided by the same meticulous hand I used to draft contracts. I had loved Laura like a sister. Now I would treat her like an adversary. In the morning, I went to the office with a thermos of coffee and the steady, precise air of a woman who has decided to catalog a life. I did not yet know how far I would go or how many pieces I would have to pick up along the way. I only knew the shape of the first step: gather. Names, dates, emails, witnesses, intentions. I would follow the paper trail like a conservator following pigment back to its origin. And in doing so, I would discover not just what Laura had done, but what I wanted the most: vindication or peace. That decision felt like a door closing. Behind it, the Kate who trusted without a ledger was gone. Ahead, there was a path sharpened by necessity. I walked into the office, and the day opened like a contract waiting for my signature. When you spend half your life reading other people's intentions as if they were footnotes, you get good at telling when a sentence is missing. For months, barely perceptible edits had been happening in our shared drive. Notes shifted, language softened, footnotes disappeared and reappeared. I told myself the obvious things: Laura's style had always been more aggressive in negotiation. She favored bilateral concessions. Perhaps she was trying to protect a fragile client relationship. But the email I'd seen on Tuesday was not an alteration. It was a plan. I replayed the encounter again and again, like a lawyer memorizing testimony. There were small things that had previously seemed trivial: Laura's phone calls at odd hours, a client who left slightly cooler messages in the voicemail box, and her sudden interest in a European partner she'd never paid much attention to before. Now they looked like a map drawn with intentions. I stood in our usual corner office, which I had long ago decorated to be both homey and intimidating: framed certificates, a plant that survived because I spoke to it in the mornings, a photograph of my family. The air felt thinner. I had a meeting in 20 minutes with a client who thought I was easy and trusted me the way people trust trained dogs. I did not want to let them see the fissure. Instead of walking into the conference room, I did what people in my position often do: I called in a colleague. Marcus was 20 years my senior, corporate in the way he wore his patience like a scarf. He had been with the firm long enough to have seen alliances break like brittle ceramics. I asked him about something innocuous: how the new partnership with the vendor in Lion was proceeding. He gave me a casual answer: then added, with the kind of half-grin people use to coach others through shocks. Laura's been on that like she's building a house out of storm windows. She's been carving our pricing down where she thinks it'll stay. Odd moves. Odd. The word landed like a pebble. Marcus's eyebrows lifted and then relaxed. We both knew that in a small company, gestures that started as risk management could become a whisper campaign. I thanked him and left with the calm of a woman who wore restraint like armor. I began collecting, a digital breadcrumb trail, meticulous and slow. I duplicated files, noted timestamps, cross-referenced calendar entries with phone logs. My hands learned the pattern of saving, archiving, encrypting. Friends, when they talk about revenge, imagine fireworks and a cinematic reveal. In reality, gathering proof is administratively taxing and morally complex. Each fact you collect is a vote you cast for one version of truth over another. My truth was accumulating like a ledger. There were things that felled me more quietly. An old draft of a client brief, mine, was in a message to a competitor with Laura's notes in the margins, underlining passages where she suggested different price suppression tactics. A note in a spreadsheet, written in the company's internal chat, suggested a timeline that would have bypassed my role entirely in the rollout of our new program. These were not accidental, they were structural. Someone had been dismantling my part in the work I had incubated. The first time I confronted Laura, I sat across from her at a cafe 5 blocks from the office, where the coffee was bitter and the croissants were flaky enough to provide a metaphor. We had eaten here before, negotiating tiny details of client proposals between bites. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that used to smooth out worry lines. I watched her hands, practiced at making an argument look easy. Laura, I said, straightforward as I could be, I need to ask you about the lion proposal. She blinked, then adopted just enough surprise to be plausible. Oh? I thought we agreed. Who did you send the negotiation plan to on March 21st? I asked. She studied me like a woman instructed to expect bad news. She could have answered with transparency, said she'd been trying to manage a client, apologized. Instead, she hemmed. I was trying to protect the client, she said. I thought if we adjusted our approach, we could keep the account. You know how precarious those partnerships are. It was a persuasive story. In a courtroom full of ambiguity, it would have been compelling. But her words didn't match the documents I'd pulled. The negotiation plan included language that undercut our own pricing model in a way that would have benefited the other firm materially. It proposed preferential treatment to a partner who had not been our strongest ally. The notes had my handwriting transcribed, almost verbatim, and not as a reference, but as material to be repurposed. I saw the email, I said. It's not just a tactic. I felt my throat tighten. It's a handover. She exhaled, the air leaving her like someone taking off a heavy coat. I had to be practical, Kate. The board has been restless about growth. They wanted results last quarter. I want to meet them halfway. There it was, the old justificatory friend, practicality. I thought of times we'd done the same for each other, when we split a difficult client because one of us had a family emergency, when she let me take the lead on a pitch because she had an idea she wanted to incubate. Reciprocity had been our unspoken law. Now it felt like barter. I didn't explode. I had learned, over years of negotiations, that rage could be misapplied. You can shout and win the argument in front of a person and lose the case in the court of facts. So I sat with the humiliation like a physical thing, heavy but present. If you felt the board was restless, I said quietly, you should have told me. We should have fixed it together. She looked genuinely pained. There were angles to her grief, too. I thought you were slower to act, she confessed. I thought you wanted more study. I thought I could shield the firm. I thought of shielding. To shield is to assume risk on behalf of another. But Laura's shield had blinders. She had taken tactical steps that excluded me instead of inviting me. It hurt because it was not malicious in the cartoon way people imagine betrayal. It was pragmatic and footnoted, and thus harder to justify with a single narrative. I left the cafe with my coffee untouched and my resolve steeled. The world I trusted had shifted under me. Some part of me wanted to forgive quickly, to stitch the torn seam, because reconciliation would have been tidy and expensive in its grace. But other parts, The parts of me that measure and who have been measured knew that reconciliation without accounting was a poor kind of amnesia. Back at the office, I did the work I'd done my whole life. I cataloged, I cross-referenced, and I made lists of potential witnesses and collateral. This was not dramatic. It was the same drafting skill I had used to write proposals that closed long-term contracts. The practical woman in me, the one that had always been most comfortable when plans had angles and contingencies, made a simple plan: gather so I could prove. The personal woman in me, small, furious, and tired, prepared itself for decisions that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. That night, when I tucked our son into bed and he asked for an extra story, I read to him about kings and queens who could be kind. I let my voice be a place where the world made gentle sense. Later, when I washed my hands in the kitchen and looked in the mirror, I had to face the way betrayal had subtly rearranged my face, quieter, colder, more precise. I was learning that important things sometimes require small, unromantic steps. I resolved to take them all. I have always been a rational person. When someone says, "I don't know why they did that," my immediate response is to look for motives and incentives. People do things for reasons that make sense in their own framework, however ugly that framework might seem to an outsider. After I found Laura's emails, I inhaled logic as if it were air. At first, I wanted to believe the good explanations. Maybe she was protecting clients. Maybe she panicked after a troubling board meeting. Maybe, God forbid, she thought she was acting in both our interests and I had misread the signs. I gave her the benefit of the doubt not because I was naive, but because it was the easiest route. Denial is sometimes a kindness people grant themselves when they are unprepared for the consequences of truth. We had a conversation that felt rehearsed for a play neither of us had wanted to perform. I asked direct questions in the quiet way I had when doing intake interviews, open-ended, encouraging honesty. The safer route was to accept a plausible explanation and move on. The more dangerous route was to demand paper trails and witnesses. I chose a third path. I asked for a meeting with the board without accusing her publicly. I wanted to frame the problem as one of process, not personality. If she had acted out of panic, the board needed to see the gap in our safeguards more than it needed to see our friendship bleed out. She seemed relieved that I would not ruin her in the moment by screaming across the table. Her relief tasted sharp to me. I had expected shame and contrition. Instead, she offered an argument. "You know how things look from the other side, Kate. I am not a villain. I just acted." So I started collecting evidence while standing the ritual persona of a reasonable colleague. In the office, I continued to make time for mentorships and phone calls. I continued to be the woman clients liked to have on their side. Secretly, though, I was doing the opposite of the impulse people assume leads to dramatic confrontations. Rather than staging an immediate public reckoning, I wore a mask of normalcy. People called it professionalism. I called it a deadline. There is something wicked about the phrase reasonable steps. In law it protects, in life it silences. I took reasonable steps. I archived versions of proposals, I printed dated copies of chat logs, and I kept meticulous notes of what each of us had contributed to projects. I documented differences between drafts I had created and the final versions that ended up in external negotiations. I even, with that grim sense of humor only lawyers and managers share, began to date stamp my own rough notes before sending them to Laura so there would be incontrovertible proof of authorship. The human heart does not always track with these legalistic precautions. There were moments when my anger would come up like bile. I would find myself imagining Laura standing in a hallway and tripping, a childish impulse I hated even as it made me feel momentarily vindicated. Other moments I felt sick with longing for how it used to be, late-night strategy sessions that had ended in laughter, the private jokes that involved T initials, our shared disdain for marketing fluff. You do not simply exile intimacy by stocking evidence in a folder, but the archive helps to settle the rawness into something that can be discussed without the fever. It was harder around other people. Some colleagues noticed a change in our dynamic and started to ask themselves which side to be on. The board, composed of people who had their own fragile securities, began to ask curious questions about the Lion partnership. A rumor here, a cautious inquiry there. Things that hadn't existed before began to accrue. The air in the office pulsed with a kind of quiet that is worse than noise. People began to move like they had learned to step around sharp things. At home, I held my tongue. My husband, ever the comfortable anchor, noticed that I was less talkative, that evenings were more likely to find me with a file spread on a dining room chair than in front of Netflix. He offered help, legal contacts, sympathetic ears, but I refused to make him a participant. There's something selfish about preserving someone's serenity from your own storm. I did not want our family to be complicit in my campaign. There are battles you wage in solitude because the only person you can trust to be precise is yourself. Still, I needed to feel less alone. I confided in a friend, Maris, who had left the industry and now taught workshops about workplace ethics. She listened without interruption and then said, gently, "You have to decide whether you want vindication or peace." There it was, spoken plainly. I had been telling myself that the two were mutually supportive. They are not. Vindication feels like a ledger balanced. Peace is quieter and often less satisfying. I did not want to sacrifice my dignity for a private sense of closure. Yet the idea of letting Laura keep the upper hand felt like swallowing shards. One afternoon, Laura invited me to lunch, which I accepted more out of curiosity than politeness. She seemed smaller than I remembered. There were new lines at her mouth, lines that perhaps belonged to worry. She told a story about a client who had threatened to withdraw budgets and how urgently she'd had to act. She framed her actions as mistakes made under pressure, an attempt to hold a crumbling house together. I was trying not to lose everything, she said. There was someone in her voice that wanted absolution. I thought of the emails and drafts I'd collected. I thought of the quietness that had seeped into my family dinners. I thought about the future trajectories that had been resketched without my input. I found that I couldn't accept the explanation. Not because I wanted to be unforgiving, but because the facts did not comport with the story she offered. Intent is slippery, action is tractable. I had the latter. So I kept my calm. I went through the motions of partnership while secretive as a fox. It's strange to say that the day-to-day cruelty was more bearable than the absence of a theatrical betrayal. Reality favors small indignities, and the one I had chosen to study was perniciously small. I began to see the outlines of a plan that wasn't about theatrical revenge, but about practical reparation. I would not simply expose her. I would make sure the architecture of our practice could not accommodate such unilateral maneuvers again. That meant fortifying contracts, insisting on transparency, and, if necessary, letting the board see what I had put together in plain, immovable terms. It was a cold calculus, and there were moments when I resented myself for choosing it. Choosing to be measured made me feel like a bureaucrat of my own pain, cataloging like an archivist of hurt. But if I had learned anything at 42, it's that feelings are ephemeral. Documents are not. So I shored up my paper trail and my resolve in equal measure. The day I handed a dossier to the chair of the board, I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady, like someone who had found a footing in a slippery place. I was still undeniably angry. The denial that had allowed me to function had been abandoned. But there was something else now, a new element in the chemistry of my days, a purpose that aligned with justice as I understood it, not vengeance for sport. I would not allow my life's work to be repurposed into someone else's short-term lifeboat. That, to me, was worth the cost. You learn quickly, in situations like this, that observation is both a skill and a discipline. It requires patience you wouldn't think you possessed, the kind that lets you sit through unremarkable meetings so you can notice how people use certain phrases, who they avoid looking at, who gets copied on email chains. I became better at reading the spaces between sentences. I started by setting up a meticulous archive system. I had always been organized, turn the right page at the right time, but this was forensic. I saved versions of drafts with redundant timestamps. I exported chat logs. I made copies of every contract iteration with tracked changes. Then I started to look at patterns. When were changes made? Who suggested them? What corridors of influence did they reflect? The office felt suddenly like a chessboard, each person a piece with moves I needed to learn. Laura was a queen in social skill. She could sidestep a barrage of questions with a smile and an anecdote. Other colleagues, Mark, who handled client relationship management, and Joanna, who did marketing, were pawns in the sense of being easily influenced by persuasive narratives. I started having casual conversations that were not casual at all. Lunches about process, coffee chats about transparency, and honest questions about how decisions were made. People didn't realize the depth of what I was doing. They mostly thought I'd become more earnest about compliance. I also became adept at listening for the small betrayals that are often collateral to the one you care about. Laura was not the only one who participated in the erosion of my role. There were people who accepted a favored narrative because it was easier to follow than the truth. It will astonish some readers that office politics can feel larger and more consequential than any one personal betrayal. It's a network. We were all woven into it, some of us with scissors concealed in our sleeves. Perhaps the most painful discovery was how many of my own compromises had left me exposed. In the past, I had let convenience trump process. I had assumed goodwill. I had forwarded documents without locking permissions, had left drafts in shared folders because collaboration seemed faster that way. All the small acts of trust had created an architecture others could exploit. The truth stung. You can be kind and still be vulnerable, and that vulnerability can be weaponized by someone who decides to prioritize their ambition over your partnership. I did my best to be disciplined about how I gathered evidence. I kept a notebook, physical, with a leather cover because there is something satisfying about a pen's indelible mark. I dated every entry and wrote only the facts: time, date, action, witness. Emotions were bracketed. I wanted to preserve this separation because the moment I started letting emotions shape the log, I risked making the narrative subjective. Documenting is cold work. Documenting saves you from hysteria. In the background of this surveillance, life continued. I had presentations and client calls and a daughter who wanted to join a dance troupe that performed on Saturdays. I hid my agitation in the ritual parts of being a parent, shopping for school supplies, making sure soccer cleats were the right size. You would be surprised how much of revenge is performed under a domestic canopy. My family remained, in many ways, the soft center where my mind could uncoil. One afternoon, as I was going through a set of emails, I noticed a message that had been sent to an external partner in Madrid. It contained language that duplicated a section I'd written months earlier about a pilot program, yet it assigned leadership to another team entirely. There were polite phrases, with respect to our colleague Kate's initial drafts, but the subtext was clear. My role was being diminished in the narrative without my consent. I felt the familiar mixture of anger and a strange, brittle amusement. This was not theft of objects. It was a theft of authorship and authority. I began to set traps that were as subtle as the betrayals we'd endured. I wrote drafts with intentional, unique phrasing that would be easily recognizable if repurposed. I sent proposals with hidden markers, like a seamstress adding a contrasting thread inside a hem. It sounds petty, but in professional work, intellectual signatures matter. They prove lineage. When someone lifts your ideas and masks them, the proof of origination is the only thing that can fix the ledger. There were moments when my surveillance felt voyeuristic. I was watching people I had once trusted do things that hurt me and wondering whether I was being cruel even as they had been cruel. The moral calculus kept shifting. I told myself that cataloging wrongs and assembling truth was not the same as revenge. I told myself that the goal was restoration of fair practice, of transparent process. But at night, under the streetlight filtering through our bedroom blinds, there were times when I admitted to myself that I had this other desire. I wanted her to feel what I felt. I wanted her to understand the emptiness that arrives when someone you love rearranges your life without consulting you. Nevertheless, I kept my focus on concrete results. And in time, the patterns coalesced. The emails mapped to meetings mapped to decisions, and the decisions mapped to outcomes that affected what I had built. One could say the evidence was circumstantial in the way a portrait is made from shading and line rather than a single photograph. But portraits, when well made, can be convincing. When I finally felt I had enough to make a substantive case, I did what any seasoned professional would do. I prepared to present it. Not in the way a scandal-obsessed tabloid might, but in a way a board respects: clean documentation, clear timelines, and the implication of risk. I would not humiliate Laura in a public spectacle. I would show the facts, and the ledger would do the rest. That, in my mind, was a more dignified approach. After months of quiet observation, I realized something else. Surveillance had also taught me to notice the parts of my life that were mine alone. The process of watching others sharpened my sense of self. I remembered why I became a leader in the first place, the small, stubborn love of making work that mattered. In the end, the work was the truest thing I had. I was not beholden to vindictiveness for its own sake. I wanted my work to remain coherent and to be acknowledged. When I finally closed the folder that contained the incriminating emails, I did so with a sense of resolve rather than triumph. The trap had been set not out of malice, but out of necessity. I had learned to watch and to wait, and in that patience I had gathered both proof and a clearer sense of what I would accept in the future. The next step would not be silence. It would be a series of precise moves that both corrected and protected. There's a particular kind of cruelty in subtlety. It isn't loud, it's surgical. When I decided I would not have a public meltdown, when I chose process over spectacle, I also chose precision. My retaliation would not be a dramatic expose, but a sequence of small, undeniable maneuvers that forced the truth into the light and closed the loopholes someone had exploited. The first thing I did was to make authorship impossible to erase. I started timestamping everything with a ridiculous level of specificity. If I drafted a proposal at midnight, the file name read Kate_proposal_2025-03-12_0023. I began inserting uniquely phrased paragraphs, little stylistic fingerprints only I used, into documents that mattered. I also built in deliberate, traceable edits. It felt petty at times, like leaving a lipstick mark on a glass, but it worked. When a passage turned up in another person's file, I could point to the exact sentence and the date it was created. In the world of corporate theft, provenance matters. I tightened permissions on shared documents and moved key drafts to a secure repository that logged access. I petitioned the board to formalize our review process, nothing theatrical, just an extra sign-off stage for any client-facing material. I framed it as good governance. We'll standardize approvals to protect client interests. The board bought it. They were quietly terrified of litigation and reputational risk. That procedural change meant that unilateral edits, the kind that had allowed Laura to reroute our work, would be harder to make without being seen. But systems alone don't catch people who are willing to be nimble. So I also started to nudge the social architecture. In meetings, I began to ask questions in public that required documented answers. Can we get that timeline in writing? Who will be the public lead for the pilot? Will the vendor sign the confidentiality addendum? Small, mundane questions, annoying perhaps, but they forced clarity. Where before a friendly email might have sufficed, decisions now needed minutes and signatures. Each question I asked was a tiny floodlight. I used clients too, but ethically. I reached out to a few long-standing clients and asked for feedback on draft language I'd shared months earlier. I framed it as client-centric diligence. Several responded with praise for particular wording that I had originally written, public votes of authorship that accumulated like testimonials. I never baited clients or asked them to take sides. I simply ensured that their responses would show the lineage of ideas. In the same vein, I got one of our most reliable partners to send a confirming email about the scope of a pilot program. A single line, as per Kate's original proposal, was enough to begin shifting perception. There were also moments of calculated delay. When Laura proposed moving a public-facing role to someone else, I politely suggested an external audit of responsibilities. I knew audits take time. Time forces people to reveal planning gaps, and it gives you breathing room to arrange evidence correctly. It annoyed colleagues. Some complained I was bureaucratic. That was fine. Anger is an acceptable side effect when the alternative is being stripped of the narrative of your own work. I won't pretend this strategy felt noble all the time. It required me to be cold in places where my default had been warmth. I lied sometimes by omission, forgetting to mention certain suspicions to make a meeting proceed in my favor. I accepted that compromise and the small indignities it entailed. Every choice had consequence. I did these things because the stakes were both practical and existential. My authorship, my career, the example I wanted to set for my daughters about standing up for oneself without spectacle. The first of those small strikes worked within weeks. A draft that had been circulating, one that used my phrasing and would have minimized my role, was pulled back because of a permissions error I flagged. Another time, a vendor demanded clarification on a pricing point and in doing so revealed an earlier email trail that recommended different terms than those Laura had presented. The board, which had previously seen only polished decks, now had documents that showed a ragged, inconsistent thread. Nothing sensational. Nothing explosive. Just facts aligning in a way that made the pattern visible. I discovered, to my surprise, that this slow, administrative kind of justice has its own satisfaction. It's the sound of logic assembling itself like a building, floor by floor, until the architecture is unmistakable. But satisfaction was mingled with fatigue. The work required constant alertness. It ate into weekends and into the quiet space I had with my family. I wondered, sometimes bitterly, what I had lost already and what I was willing to sacrifice to reclaim what had been taken. The small strikes were only the beginning. They revealed a truth I had half known, that the person you loved could be both human and fallible and dangerous in perfectly ordinary ways. Now that the light was beginning to fall on the seams, I had to decide how far I would go. The ledger was filling. The next moves would be harder and likely louder. I braced myself for them and for the inevitable cost. There's a peculiar hum in the room when someone you trusted falters in public. It's not thunderous. It's the soft click of people recalibrating their assumptions. That hum started the afternoon Laura presented the Lion Partnership to a client panel and our key stakeholders. I sat in the third row, hands folded in my lap, feeling like an audience member at a play I'd helped write. I had not planned for the moment to be theatrical. My small strikes were designed to create structural integrity, not spectacle. But structure has a way of revealing itself suddenly, like scaffolding catching light, and when it did, it made some things impossible to hide. Laura had been confident in her rehearsal. She'd practiced the deck, smoothed her transitions, and rehearsed answers to the predictable objections. What she did not anticipate was an innocuous question from the client about a clause in the scope that directly referenced the pilot methodology I'd authored. The clause, one of my fingerprints, had been preserved in the archived drafts, and I had quietly ensured that the client had the version showing my leadership on scope design. When the client asked, "Can you walk us through how this methodology came about?" the room shifted. Laura froze for a beat that lasted like the ticking of a clock on a long night. She answered, but the answer was thin, as if she were saying words she did not own. Her voice found a plausible narrative about cross-collaboration, but then a partner on the client side interrupted gently. It's helpful to have the origin story. We have an email here that references Kate's original framework. The partner held up a tablet with the archived email. The audience saw the header, the date, my name. It was not a shout. There was no dramatic accusation. The client's tone was curious and professional. Businesses do what businesses must, but the effect was seismic. People began to look at Laura differently. Questions that had been routine took on a sharper edge. Someone asked about who would lead the pilot at a public level, and Laura's answer was vague. The board members exchanged looks. I felt the air prickle with the knowledge that invisible loyalties were moving into visible scrutiny. I did not gloat. My sense of victory was not a party. It was a cold, measured confirmation. The architecture I'd built was working. The permissions tightened, the archived versions, the client confirmation, each had done its quiet job. Laura's moment of faltering was the inevitable consequence of a narrative being corrected. What surprised me was not the practical fallout, but how quickly small social cracks widened. Colleagues who had been casual in their allegiance began to distance themselves. There were emails that used cautious language. People who had once been quick to congratulate now offered only neutral nods. In the cafeteria, the volume of chatter dropped slightly when I walked in. Success, in this context, made me more solitary. Laura left the meeting with her hands wrapped around her notes as if they were a life preserver. Later that afternoon, she sent an email to the team, apologizing for any confusion, promising to clarify the origin of the pilot. Her apology was economical. It sought to smooth the surface without addressing the deeper architecture that had allowed her to redirect the narrative in the first place. I read her message with a sense of odd detachment. She would repair what she could, The rest required institutional correction, which I had set in motion. When I drove home that day, the city felt different. The streets were the same, the light the same, but my relationship to the people I worked with had shifted. I had begun to be seen in small, measured ways as a person who had a boundary around her work. That boundary was less about me being vindictive and more about preserving integrity. Still, the cost was immediate, a thinning of the circle that had once surrounded me. At dinner that evening, my daughter described a school play where the villain got his comeuppance. She loved stories with moral closure, where wrongs were made right by a single line. I wanted to tell her that real life is messier, that corrections are slow, sometimes lonely, and often incomplete. Instead, I smiled and said, sometimes people get what they deserve. It wasn't the whole truth. What I tasted in my mouth at that moment was not triumph, but a complicated mixture: relief, exhaustion, and a small, steady ache of loss. The spark had been struck. The quiet hum in the office had grown louder. The next phases would bring harder questions, including how far we could push the facts before damage became irreversible. I was prepared for that. Preparedness, it turned out, was the new currency I carried: no glitter, just the steady clink of truth assembled into a case. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came like slow rain, first a drizzle of whispers, then a steady pour of consequences that soaked through everything I had built. At first, the firm tried to pretend nothing had happened. Officially, the Lion presentation had been a miscommunication, and leadership moved quickly to realign ownership and collaboration structures. That meant new committees, new oversight, and the one thing every executive dreads: an internal review. The review wasn't directed at me, at least not explicitly, but it felt like I was under a microscope anyway. Every document, every email, every decision of the past 2 years was suddenly fair game. Meetings were quieter. Colleagues smiled politely, but their eyes avoided mine. It wasn't hostility, it was calculation. They were measuring distance, deciding whether it was safer to be near me or not. Laura, meanwhile, went into what I can only describe as controlled damage mode. She was still composed, still impeccably dressed, still calling people darling in the hallway, but I could sense the tremor beneath the surface. She began scheduling more private conversations, taking long lunches with board members, and rewriting the story before it hardened into fact. She wasn't stupid. She knew the narrative could still be salvaged if she played her cards right. And me? I was tired. Bone tired. The kind of exhaustion that no vacation can cure. Every move I made felt strategic now, even simple things like walking into the cafeteria or replying to an email. I was acutely aware of perception, how a pause could be interpreted as guilt, how assertiveness could look vindictive. At home, the cracks started to show. My husband, Mark, had been patient through the first weeks, offering supportive nods and dinners I didn't touch. But one night, as I sat in the living room rereading an internal memo, he finally asked, "Is this ever going to end, Kate?" I looked up at him, startled by how weary his voice sounded. "It has to," I said quietly. "It's about principle." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Principle's great, but you're losing yourself in it. You come home with your jaw locked and your eyes somewhere else. I don't even know who you're fighting anymore, or yourself." His words stung because they were true. The anger that had once been clean, a sharp line between right and wrong, had blurred into something heavier, slower. I wasn't sure where the pursuit of fairness ended and the need for control began. The next week, HR summoned me for a routine conversation. The director, a man named Will with the perpetual expression of someone about to deliver bad news, smiled too much. "Kate," he began, "we're doing a comprehensive process review. It's not personal. Just policy. Not personal." I'd heard that phrase so many times in my career that it had lost meaning. Everything is personal when your name is on the file. For 2 hours, they walked me through timelines, access logs, project histories, questions that were neutral on the surface, but pointed underneath. I answered calmly, providing documentation, careful to show neither defensiveness nor triumph. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being interrogated for defending my own authorship. By Friday, the air in the office felt electric. Rumors drifted through the corridors that the board might restructure, that both Laura and I were under review. A colleague I'd mentored years ago sent a cryptic text, "Be careful who you trust now." I stopped sleeping properly. At 2 a.m., I'd scroll through files and notes, reading every exchange with Laura over the past year, trying to pinpoint when the betrayal had started. There was no single moment, just a gradual erosion, a smile that lasted a beat too long, a compliment that doubled as a warning. Then came the social isolation, the most insidious part of corporate fallout. Invitations stopped arriving. Team lunches went on without me. Meetings that I'd always been looped into now had conflicting schedules. I became a presence people acknowledged but no longer included. And yet, beneath all that, there was still something like clarity. The truth had been seen. It wasn't officially declared, not yet, but it was known in the quiet, unspoken way things are known in offices. People had started saying my name differently, not with pity, but with a hint of caution, even respect. I had drawn a line, and though I was standing alone on one side of it, the boundary itself was intact. Still, solitude can feel like punishment when you've lived your whole life as part of a team. I began questioning if justice always demanded collateral damage, if maybe, to hold someone else accountable, you had to sacrifice your own comfort. One night, as I closed my laptop and stared at my reflection in the dark window, I whispered to the empty room, "You wanted fairness, Kate. Now live with it." It wasn't melodramatic, just honest. Fairness, I was learning, doesn't come dressed in glory. It comes in shades of gray, with isolation and exhaustion as its companions. The fallout wasn't over. I could sense Laura preparing her counterattack, quiet, strategic, inevitable. And I knew that the next chapter would not be about defense anymore. It would be about survival. The first sign of Laura's retaliation came not with a confrontation, but with a whisper. It started as a subtle shift. People stopped forwarding me updates. My name disappeared from calendar invites I'd normally be essential to. Then, an odd email appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, "Clarifying contributions." It was a neatly worded message from a communications manager, copied to half the executive team. "Hi Kate," it began, "just looping you in as we prepare a brief for the upcoming audit. We're trying to ensure all project credits are accurately distributed. Laura mentioned you'd reviewed some of these documents together, so if you can confirm your specific role in the Lion proposal, that would be great." My specific role. It was a clever move, not an accusation, just a seed of doubt dressed as procedure. By replying, I'd look defensive. By staying silent, complicit. It was exactly the kind of weapon Laura knew how to use, bureaucracy as camouflage for betrayal. Within days, I began to see the ripple effect. Colleagues I'd trusted started keeping distance. One of the junior analysts stopped coming to my office altogether, choosing to relay messages through my assistant. I overheard two department heads discussing internal tensions, their voices hushed, but their eyes sharp. Then came the gossip. Always the gossip. Someone claimed I'd been hoarding data. Another whispered that I'd been too aggressive with clients. A rumor surfaced that the Lion deal had almost collapsed because of my overreach. I recognized Laura's fingerprints everywhere, not overt lies, but distortions of half-truths, twisted into shapes that made me look difficult, unstable, even vindictive. She was playing the long game, the narrative one. While I'd spent weeks collecting evidence and strengthening my position, Laura had been collecting sympathies. And in an environment where perception often mattered more than proof, she was winning. The HR director, Will, called me in again. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed. "Kate, we've received some feedback from the team about morale. Nothing formal, just concerns about the atmosphere. You've been under a lot of stress, and perhaps some of that's showing." He leaned forward, palms pressed together. "We value your leadership, but maybe take a step back from direct oversight for a while? Let your team breathe." I stared at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to make myself smaller?" He hesitated. "No, I'm suggesting you give others space." "Same thing," I said quietly. When I left his office, my hands were trembling. Not from fear, from rage. This was what female anger looked like in professional spaces, misinterpreted, reframed, disciplined into compliance. At home, Mark tried to console me. He'd stopped giving advice, now he just listened. One evening, I broke down for the first time since this all began. Not from guilt, but from sheer exhaustion, the ache of being rewritten in real time. "She's trying to erase me," I whispered into my glass of wine. Mark's voice was soft. "Then write yourself back in." I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, drafting a new kind of plan. This wouldn't be a counterattack in the same form, not gossip or positioning. I'd learned from watching her that perception could be turned. So I began building something harder to distort: transparency. The next morning, I asked to host a cross-departmental workshop, open collaboration, lessons from the Lion Project. The title sounded generous, even humble. In reality, it was strategy. By publicly walking through the process, the documentation, the methodology, all in a calm, factual tone, I would make the truth visible again. No accusations. No drama. Just evidence softly lit. The session was standing room only. Laura attended, sitting near the back, her expression politely unreadable. I moved through the presentation slowly, explaining our development process step by step, emphasizing teamwork but naming contributors clearly, with dates and references. Every mention of my work was backed by a file, a client note, a visible paper trail. By the time I finished, the atmosphere had shifted, not dramatically, but undeniably. The data spoke for itself. There were nods, quiet murmurs, the subtle weight of collective realization. Laura clapped first, her smile taut, controlled. "Beautifully done," she said. "Very thorough." I met her gaze. Clarity always helps. That night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. Victory without trust is just silence dressed in competence. Still, I had regained ground enough to stand again. Laura would not stop, I knew that. But neither would I. The game was no longer about revenge. It was about endurance and about redefining the rules in a way that she couldn't play anymore. The next strike, I realized, wouldn't come from her emails or mine. It would come from the boardroom, where perception became decision and loyalty was just another form of currency. And this time, I planned to be holding the pen. There is a particular hush that settles over you when consequences begin to arrive from every direction. It isn't sudden. It's accumulative, the whisper of dinners missed, the steady closing of doors you once thought were always ajar, the small diplomatic pauses from people who used to be effusive. I thought I had counted the costs. I had calculated, documented, planned. I had built armor of fact. What I did not do was account for how the weather inside me would change. The week everything felt like too much started with a Friday I had been expecting to be ordinary. A client call, a late lunch with a potential partner, bedtime stories for the kids. Instead, it became a slow, tightening pressure. The board's review produced a cautious memo that praised process improvements, while also recommending a temporary reassignment of leadership roles pending a fuller audit. No explicit blame, only a procedural recalibration that left both Laura and me in a holding pattern. To people outside the room, it sounded impartial. To me, it felt like suspension without adjudication. I began to notice the small but intimate losses. Invitations dwindled. The woman who used to call me every month to trade notes about professional development stopped texting. My mentor, someone I had always trusted to be candid, began to hedge in conversations, as if saying the unsayable might splinter whatever network of alliances remained. At home, Mark tried to be constant, but the weight of my preoccupation started to take its toll. We argued about things that had nothing to do with Laura, a messy sink, a forgotten PTA email, and those arguments were like flares revealing how raw the rest of me had become. Worst of all was the loneliness that grew not from absence, but from distance. People kept their distance not because they disliked me, but because they were afraid of being entangled. That kind of social isolation is peculiar. It is filled with people, but none of them will press near enough to warm you. My daughters asked if I could come to the school play. I wanted to say yes and mean it. Instead, I found myself clearing my calendar only to fill the time with calls and follow-ups. When I was finally at the play, I watched them perform and felt like a spectator at a life that had been partitioned. There was a peculiar, corrosive satisfaction in the small victories I'd engineered. A colleague who had minimized my role was now more careful with public attributions. The audit had revealed inconsistencies that bolstered my case. Laura had lost momentum in certain pitches, but satisfaction was thin, like sugar on a tongue aching from salt. It did not heal the emptiness I felt after a tough day. It did not produce the warmth of being seen by the people you love. The ledger balanced, but my inner books showed deficit. One night, I cried the kind of tears that have no sound, those sudden, private sobs that make your ribs hurt. I realized with a cold clarity that the campaign I'd waged had become something I didn't entirely recognize. I had set out to right a wrong. Along the way, I had also been driven by a need to punish a betrayal, to make someone else understand the rupture they'd caused. The problem was that punishment and understanding are not the same thing. Laura, in her own way, had been broken and brilliant and fierce. I had wanted to break her in return. The realization made me feel ashamed. By morning, I was resolved to change course. Not out of nobility, there was nothing particularly noble in feeling remorse, but out of a pragmatic recognition that I could not continue to live in a suspended state. There are moments in life when you must choose whether you will be defined by what was done to you or by what you will do next. I wanted the latter. The pivot was quiet. It started with small, internal work. I began to set boundaries not as traps, but as protection. I asked for help not as a confession of failure, but as a practical step. I spoke with a counselor who specialized in workplace betrayal, someone recommended by a friend, because I needed a place to lay out my anger without it becoming a dossier. The sessions were humbling. They forced me to name what I had lost beyond professional credit, the simple pleasure of being able to rely on another person without second-guessing their motives. They also forced me to see how much I had tethered my identity to a particular version of success. Practically, the change meant less reactivity. Instead of framing every move as part of a tactical retribution, I shifted to rebuilding and repair where possible. I expanded my network outside the company, mentors from other industries, a peer group that met monthly over coffee, and started to invest in projects that were not about defending territory, but about creating new ground. I took on a small pro bono consulting project with a local nonprofit, work that mattered because its impact was immediate and unambiguous. That helped. Doing work that was not about internal fights reminded me why I had chosen this career, to create something that mattered beyond spreadsheets and authorship lines. At the same time, I accepted that some things could not be restored. Not every friendship can be sewn back together. Not every trust can be rebuilt. Acceptance, I discovered, was not surrender, but a careful accounting of what could be carried forward. There would be scars. There would be lessons. I decided to let the lesson be the teacher rather than the wound be the lesson itself. When I finally met Laura months later, the conversation was not cathartic in the way a novel might promise. We spoke plainly, without theatrics. There was apology on my part and on hers, though neither apology fixed what had been lost. What it did, strangely, was permit a kind of small human exchange that had been impossible during the height of the war. We recognized that both of us had been acting from fear and hunger, for security, for control, for recognition. It didn't absolve anything, but it humanized the conflict in a way that made it bearable. Rock bottom had been instructive. It had stripped me of illusions about invulnerability, about the sufficiency of evidence to heal a heart. It also taught me that rage can be a useful engine but a poor architect. If you build a life on anger, it will be functional and brittle. If you build on values, even when they are tested, you construct something that can bend. There was no tidy moral to the fall. No cinematic reveal where everyone claps and the protagonist strides into sunlight. Instead, there were smaller, sturdier things, a renewed commitment to boundaries, a gentler approach to trust, and a professional life reshaped not by retribution, but by restoration. I did not become softer. I became, I hope, wiser about which strands of myself to guard and which to share. By the time I decided to change the rules, I had learned that tempers make poor architects. Anger gives you momentum, but momentum without structure is just motion. I needed structure. I needed a playbook that didn't rely on the brittle theatrics of scandal or the slow burn of petty reprisals. I needed something durable: law, process, allies outside our small island, and a public argument grounded in facts rather than feeling. First, I hired counsel. It felt oddly extravagant to engage outside lawyers for what I had hoped would be an internal fix, but the moment the board's review turned procedural, everything became a legal question. The woman I retained, an older partner with an Irish lilt and a fondness for careful questions, didn't promise fireworks. She promised precision. "We're not here to burn bridges," she said on our first call. "We're here to make sure the architecture doesn't fail again." That sentence felt like a relief. Our initial sessions were exhausting and clinical. We sifted through drafts I had archived, reconstructed timelines, and translated my notebook entries into legal exhibits. My counsel taught me how to frame authorship in a way that mattered in corporate governance, not as vanity, but as risk mitigation. If someone can repurpose your work and bind the company into unfavorable terms, the company is at risk. Framed that way, my grievance looked less like a personal vendetta and more like a governance issue that demanded correction. I also broadened my coalition. I reached out to clients, not to weaponize them, but to invite them into clarity. Several long-term partners agreed to share written recollections, short emails confirming that a methodology had originated in my drafts, that certain scopes were discussed in calls where I'd led. Those notes were not dramatic, they were matter-of-fact. One CEO wrote, simply, "Kate designed the pilot framework that shaped our engagement." Signed and dated. Those small confirmations piled up like quiet witnesses. Internally, I cultivated allies who appreciated process. Marcus, the senior colleague who'd once given me a half-grin about odd moves, became an important conduit. We worked together to draft a new approval workflow and a transparent authorship registry, practical tools that would prevent future unilateral reroutes. I proposed a modest change to how we attributed work on proposals, a visible authorship line on every client-facing document, and a mandatory approval path for pricing decisions. It was boring, bureaucratic, and precisely what we needed. The board responded to the reframing. When the issue was presented as governance risk with client corroboration and a clear, low-cost fix, it was difficult for them to posture. They approved the policy changes and instructed HR to roll out training on record-keeping and collaborative authorship. It wasn't vindication in the soap opera sense, but it was institutional closure, a tangible correction of the conditions that permitted the betrayal. I still expected a final reckoning. The board's adjustments and the client confirmations had set the stage, but the kind of closure I wanted would likely come in a formal moment, a vote, a personnel decision, an external announcement. I was readying myself for that meeting. I had the facts, the allies, and a quieter confidence. What I did not have was certitude about how I would feel when it happened. Would vindication heal what the betrayal had broken? I didn't know. I only knew that whatever came next, I would face it from a place I had chosen, not from a hunger to punish, but from the steadier desire to protect what I and others had built. The morning of the board meeting felt like walking into winter. The air was sharp, the sky an indifferent slate, and every breath I took fogged in small, visible doubts. Counsel had advised me to be orderly and spare with words. Marcus had rehearsed the timeline with me until the dates sounded like a metronome. I dressed in a suit that made sense rather than a suit that announced anything. Ritual matters. A clean, deliberate exterior steadied the interior tremors. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. There were 9 faces at the table, each bearing the expression of someone who has spent a career mistrusting sudden certainty. Laura sat across from me, composed. Her composure was a costume I knew well. We'd worn it together in client rooms for years. She smiled in that way that once felt like an invitation and now felt like armor. We began with procedure. The chair read the agenda, then invited me to present my documentation. I stood, hands steady, and laid out the evidence in the way I had practiced. A clear chronology, client corroboration emails, archived drafts with time-stamped edits, and the policy recommendation that my counsel had helped me draft. Each piece was a small, cold fact, no flourish, no accusation, just an account of how decisions had been made and how my role had been materially altered without process or consent. Laura's lawyer objected to certain characterizations. There was counsel speak and careful phrasing, the little legal hedges that try to turn narrative back into ambiguity. Laura spoke too. She offered explanations that folded into one another: pressure from partners, miscommunication, a misguided attempt to salvage a client relationship. There were apologies wrapped in conditionals. If anyone was hurt, she said. If. If is a small word that tries to shrink the world. What struck me most in those hours was not the legal wrangling, but how truth, when assembled methodically, becomes difficult to sustain as fiction. The clients who had written short confirming notes were summoned for private calls. One by one, they reiterated their recollections, the framework, the initial calls, the drafts they had seen. The board listened. The timeline held. The documents were indifferent to charm and eloquence. The decision was not theatrical. There was no dramatic finger-pointing or spectacular firing. The board voted to censure Laura for unilateral actions that had risked client relationships and to place her on a performance improvement plan with explicit constraints. They adopted the authorship registry and approved the governance changes I'd proposed. They also issued a statement to the firm reinforcing transparency and accountability. In effect, the system itself was altered. The loopholes that had allowed the betrayal were closed. Hearing the resolution felt strange. A part of me, the practical woman who had spent months collecting proof, felt relieved. The company was safer now in a way that mattered beyond my personal grievance. Clients had clarity, colleagues had new rules to follow. Another part of me, a quieter part, felt bereft. Discipline without reconciliation is an uneasy currency. Laura remained employed. She remained across from me in the hallway with that practiced calm. We had not come to terms so much as reached a détente brokered by policy. When I left the building, the sky had thinned. Outside, the city moved on the way cities do, indifferent and alive. My phone buzzed with messages, Marcus with a few dry jokes, clients with polite congratulations, Mark with a single text that read, "Proud of you, but come home. We'll order Thai." I smiled so hard my face hurt. That is the oddity of professional victory. It requires a private anchorage. I wanted, more than anything, to eat noodles and let someone else decide what movie to watch. That night, we did what exhausted families do. We ate too much and watched a dumb comedy. For a few hours, my head quieted. My daughters climbed into our bed at 3 in the morning, tangled like little arguments I'd forgotten I'd had. Their breath against my neck steadied me in a way the boardroom never could. The aftermath in the office felt different the next week. Some people reached out with warmth, others kept a studied distance. Laura's workload shifted. She sent a brief note to the team acknowledging the board's decisions and affirming her commitment to the firm. There was no humiliation in it, only a professional acceptance. That, perhaps, was the most painful lesson. Sometimes accountability is a quiet, bureaucratic thing rather than a dramatic unmasking. It leaves room for survival on both sides. I did receive one small, unexpected thing, an email from a junior analyst I'd mentored years ago. "Thank you," it read, "for standing up not just for yourself, but for how we work here." I can't tell you how much that means. The message landed like a benediction. It reminded me that while victory did not stitch everything back, it did signal a turn, a recalibration of expectations for those who would come after us. That evening, in the half-light of our kitchen, Mark put his hand over mine. "You did what you needed to do," he said. I looked at him and saw the familiar, quiet man who had been my anchor through years of promotions and bad coffee. "Was it worth it?" he asked. I thought about the months of small strikes, about the nights of cold calculation, and the afternoons of bone-deep weariness. I thought of my daughters and the way they laughed at the stupid commercials. "Yes," I said finally, but it wasn't a quick answer. It was necessary. Not because I wanted revenge, but because the rules needed to be clear. There would be a reckoning yet more intimate than policy, a conversation to have with Laura where names and excuses would matter less than the admission of how we had been changed. I did not expect absolution. I did not expect friendship. I expected something narrower, an honest, if painful, accounting across a table. That meeting, when it came, would not decide the past. It might, however, decide how we both lived forward. For now, The board had made its decision, the firm had adjusted its architecture, and I could see a horizon that included work without the constant prick of doubt. It was not a triumph in any radiant sense. It was the relief of a house repaired, the steady comfort of locks that worked. And in the small, private room of my life, the one with the soft couch and the messy pile of children's drawings, I let myself rest for the first time in months, knowing the next conversation would be the hardest one yet. We chose a neutral place to meet. A small, glassed conference room on the 7th floor. The kind of room that smells faintly of lemon cleaner and recycled air. It was neither my office nor hers. That was deliberate. Neutrality makes things feel less like an ambush and more like an arrangement. I arrived early and sat with my hands folded on the table, watching my own reflection blur with the city. I rehearsed nothing. Rehearsals become scripts, and scripts can hide what's true. She came in with that familiar gait, confident, precise, and for a second the room folded into the old rhythm of us. Two people who knew how to finish each other's sentences and how to make a client feel like the only person in the room. Then she saw me, and for the first time since the email, the smile faltered. There was something hollow in her face that hadn't been there before, a thinness that made her look younger and more tired at once. "Kate," she said simply, and we sat down. We started with the obvious, small courtesies that felt like patting around the wound. "How are the girls?" she asked. "Mark sent his regards." I replied in the way we always had, courteous and clipped, the old rituals still functioning as social oil. But the small talk ran thin quickly. We both knew why we were there. "I wanted this to be private," I began, because sometimes stating the small, practical fact of intention is itself an act of care. "I thought it would help us speak openly." She nodded. "I wanted that too," she said. There was a long pause. Between us lay a folder with the board's memo, typed lines of policy and consequence. It felt ridiculous and enormous at the same time. The institutional language had done what it was meant to. It had rendered our messy betrayal into tidy sentences, assigned penalties, and added new permissions. It had not, and could not, touch what had been felt. Laura started, then closed her mouth. She had always been good with words. Stripped of them, she looked unarmed. "I am sorry, Kate," she said finally. "Not because the board told me to be, but because I see what I did." Hearing her apology was like being offered both a bandage and a scalpel. I wanted to accept it because it was a human thing. I also wanted to measure the weight of it. "Do you know why you did it?" I asked, more to understand than to indict. Understanding is not the same as excusing, and I have always preferred precise distinctions. She breathed out, like someone letting go of a held note. "I was afraid." The board had been talking about growth in numbers, and I thought if I didn't act, we'd lose an account and that would reflect on me. I made choices thinking I was protecting us. I didn't think about what it meant to leave you out. There was the confession of fear, not dramatic, but human. Fear, I thought, is often the fuel of betrayal. And the dishonest part? I pressed gently. The parts where you repurposed my drafts and reassigned leadership without telling me. She closed her eyes as if searching for a map. "I made terrible choices," she said. "I told myself I would fix it later. I told myself you'd understand once the client was secure. That was self-serving. I used your trust like a tool, and that was wrong." I had accumulated 1,000 rehearsed riposts over the months, some savage, some coldly clever. None of them fit now. The person across from me was not the monster in a caricature of hurt. She was a flawed woman with the same marrow of fear and hunger I carried. It didn't make what she did less damaging, but it did make the exchange possible. "Did you ever think about what it would do to me?" I asked. Not just professionally, about my family, my reputation, the hours I would spend proving authorship because something you did behind my back changed the narrative? She flinched, and for a moment the old Laura cracked. "No," she admitted. "I thought about expediency and results. I didn't think about the human costs." "I'm sorry I hurt you." There was a long silence after that, the kind where the air seems to hold its breath. I realized I had expected catharsis, a single, cleansing speech that would make everything right. Life, predictably, refused such simplicity. "What I need from you," I said finally, "is not a dramatic apology. It's acknowledgement and change. You have to understand the damage and not do it again. The policies are in place, but change means something different when it's embodied. She listened, tears brimming but not falling. I know, she whispered. I don't expect your forgiveness. I only want to be honest now. We spoke for a long time after that, not about headlines or sanctions, but about particular moments, late nights at airports, the time she stayed with my mother when surgery was imminent, the way we used to trade notes that felt like gifts. Those memories were both balm and salt. We admitted to selfishness and fear. We named the small compromises we had each made that created a field where betrayal could grow. When we rose to leave, our hug was awkward and human. It didn't feel like reconciliation. It felt like two people acknowledging a fracture without trying to paper over it. On the elevator down, she said softly, I am sorry I broke that trust. I am sorry too, I said, for things I had done in the heat of strategy that might have pressured her into choices she later regretted. Apologies stacked, messy and necessary, like the uneven bricks of a new wall. Walking back to my office, I felt something like a window open in me, not wide, not blinding, but letting a little fresh air in. The conversation had not healed the wound, but it had moved it from the realm of rumor and policy into the realm of truth. That mattered. It meant we could both, in our own ways, choose how to live with what had been done. I do not pretend to have forgiven fully. Forgiveness is a long landscape, and I was only at the gate. But I also did not carry the old, burning desire to make her suffer for suffering's sake. There is a quieter victory now, the ability to tell the truth across a table and to insist that our profession be governed by the same honesty we demand of ourselves. We left the company that day as different people, and in small ways I felt lighter. The ledger in my head had been balanced not by retribution but by acknowledgement. That, perhaps, is the most grown-up form of mercy I could afford myself, to accept the complexity of a human failing and to decide how much of it I would carry forward. When the dust finally settled, I discovered that rebuilding felt less like renovation and more like cartography. You don't simply put the old roads back, you redraw the map. Some paths are closed forever. New ones open. The surprising part was that the map was mine to draft. In the months after the board's decision and our conversation, my days regained a different kind of rhythm. Not the frantic pulse of constant defense, but a steadier cadence. Meetings that started and ended on time. Family dinners I actually attended. Projects I picked because they excited me, not because they were battlegrounds. I began saying no more often, which felt at first like a small rebellion and then like a necessary refining. Saying no is a tiny act of self-preservation that has enormous consequence. It protects the work you want to do and the life you want to live. Professionally, I leaned into building rather than policing. I proposed a mentorship circle for mid-career women in our industry, a space for candid conversation about credit, boundaries, and negotiation that I wished I'd had at 29. The first cohort met in a conference room scattered with post-it notes and stubborn optimism. We talked about how to claim authorship without seeming defensive, how to negotiate credit with clarity, and how to recognize early signs of unhealthy competition. Those evenings were electrifying in a new way. I found purpose in equipping others with the tools I'd fought so hard to install. I also took on a new initiative at the firm, a sponsored research project with a university partner to study collaborative authorship models and consulting. It was decidedly unglamorous, surveys, interviews, a mountain of data, but it mattered because it institutionalized what I'd argued for. Data creates structures that are harder to ignore than a single complaint. The project gave me a professional platform that felt constructive rather than reactive, and it reconnected me with the part of my work I loved, making systems that actually help people do their jobs better. At home, the small things repaired with time and intention. Mark and I started a simple habit, a weekly no devices dinner where we talked about nothing consequential. Our daughters learned that the arc of a parent's day can include setbacks and still end in tenderness. I started splitting weekend duties with less resentment and more collaboration. The quiet recovery of ordinary life, giggling over breakfast cereal, folding laundry while an old movie plays, turned out to be as restorative as any glossy retreat. My relationship with Laura settled into something neither close nor hostile. We were colleagues with a complex shared history. We exchanged professional pleasantries that were warm in tone but measured. There were occasional collaborations, done within the new system and with clear authorship lines. It wasn't friendship as it had been, but it was a workable professional arrangement, and, honestly, some wounds are too large for full repair. I accepted that. Acceptance, I learned, is not the same as forgetting. It is a decision about what weight you carry. The most unexpected consequence of the whole episode was how it recalibrated my appetite for recognition. I realized I didn't need to be publicly lauded to feel that my work mattered. There's a private satisfaction in knowing your ideas helped a team, transformed a client, or improved a process. That kind of quiet validation is durable and doesn't depend on applause. Occasionally, when I find myself at a conference or mentoring a junior who reminds me of my early self, I tell the story, not as a morality tale, but as a map. I talk about boundaries, about small administrative habits that protect intellectual work, and about the strange economy of trust. Most importantly, I talk about how to choose battles. Some battles are worth the heat they bring, others will simply burn what remains of you. I don't pretend everything is perfect. There are nights when the old ache returns and I replay conversations like a scratched record. There are people who still view me through the prism of that conflict. But overall, life feels wider. I am more intentional in the way I show up, kinder about the limits I set, and less tolerant of the slow corrosions that once went unchecked. If there's a lesson I'd hand to my younger self, it would be this: be generous with trust, but keep a ledger. Not to fuel distrust, but to protect the integrity of what you build. And remember that restoration is a practice, not an event. It's in the small decisions, the meetings you run, the policies you shape, and the quiet kindnesses you offer your family when the day is done. I am Kate, still ambitious, still deliberate, now with a map redrawn by experience. The betrayal altered my course, yes, but it did not erase the person who believed in craft, clarity, and careful courage. I am not the same woman I was at the beginning of this story. I am, I think, a truer one. When I try to describe this last year to people who haven't lived it, I usually begin with the small things: how morning coffee tastes different when your mind is cataloging emails for evidence, how a child's laugh can cut through the worst of a boardroom day. The big events are easier to name: the email I found, the board meeting, the policies changed, the conversation with Laura. But what stays with me are the subtle pivot points. The way I learned to stop confusing vindication with healing, the particular quiet of a family dinner after a long day of careful, deliberate work. The epilogue of this chapter of my life is not one tidy moment. It is a slow reopening. There is a private geography to recovery. It started in banal ways: saying no to projects that would ask me to give more than I had, delegating work without guilt, turning my phone off at times that used to feel impossible to protect. I paid attention to the edges of my life. Sexier work trips declined in favor of local engagements I could do without losing a Sunday. Evenings became sacrosanct, reserved for homework help and family meals rather than late-night strategizing. These are not glamorous reforms. They are practical, stubborn acts that built a margin where I could breathe. Professionally, the changes I fought for didn't make ripples so much as they rerouted currents. The authorship registry and the documented approval processes felt like seatbelts, unromantic, effective. They have prevented the kind of quiet appropriations that once felt like betrayal. More than that, I poured energy into mentoring and into structural work, workshops on collaborative credit, a research project with an academic partner, and a mentorship circle for mid-career women that became one of the most nourishing parts of my week. Teaching others the protocols I'd learned was its own form of repair. It turned private anger into public utility. What surprised me was how much the work of restoration required me to look inward. It would have been simpler to stay in a posture of righteous outrage. Anger is a fuel that propels you forward with crystalline belief. But rage, sustained, becomes a make-do architecture, serviceable but brittle. I spent months in a counselor's office, learning to separate what I owed to fairness from what I owed to my own peace. That was harder than any negotiation. It required patience, humility, and the willingness to accept that some losses would never be fixed. It taught me to cultivate curiosity about my vulnerabilities rather than hide them. Curiosity became a compass where suspicion had been the map. My relationship with Laura never returned to the intimacy it once had. Sometimes I still hear a joke we used to share and feel a small, sharp pang. But our interactions became professional and honest in ways that mattered. We collaborated within boundaries and with clear attributions. When we could not work together productively, we did not pretend otherwise. There is dignity in such honest segmentation. It allows both people to move forward without the pretense of a repaired heart. At home, the slow reopening was kinder. Mark and I rebuilt rhythms, simple rituals that signaled presence rather than productivity. We instituted a weekly no devices dinner and began splitting weekends into blocks that balanced family, work, and rest. My daughters grew comfortable with a mother who could both be fierce and still set down work to read them a story. They learned one of the best lessons I could give them: boundaries are a form of love. Those months also changed the way I thought about trust. I no longer hand it out like candy to anyone who asks. I set boundaries and keep a ledger of professional contributions, not as a mechanism for bitterness, but as a covenant of clarity. Trust, in my experience now, is something that accrues alongside accountability. You can be generous without being naive. You can be kind without being gullible. Sometimes people ask whether I regret having pursued accountability so fiercely. The answer is complicated. There are nights when I miss the old simplicity of faith, when I long for the days where sharing a draft was an unproblematic act of collaboration. But I do not regret that I acted. Letting something as foundational as authorship and authority be quietly repurposed felt like letting air leak from an important tire. That would have made a long journey precarious. Fixing it required work, and work has its own dignity. If there is a single sentence that carries what I want to pass on, it is this: defend the architecture of your life so that you can keep making things that matter. Defend it with the same attentiveness you would use to steward a fragile vessel. For me, that looked like paperwork and counsel and meetings and long talks on the couch with Mark. It looked like late-night edits and quiet apologies, and the slow rebuilding of a professional reputation. It was laborious and often lonely. It was also, in its patient way, life-saving. I am not the same woman who opened her inbox that Tuesday. I am, if anything, more deliberate and more tender with myself. I still love my work, the idea of crafting systems and words that help organizations be better. I still love the warmth of late-night conversations with clients and the small, private victories of a well-written proposal. But I move differently now, with clearer borders, less appetite for noise, and a steadier hand when it comes to what I let define me. As for Laura, as for the firm, time has smoothed some edges and revealed others. People adapt, institutions do the same. The policies we put in place have outlived the drama, and in that sense the work was a success. In quieter ways, too, I have allowed myself to be surprised by goodness, by colleagues who reached out not for what I could give them, but to say thank you, by new mentors who offered perspective, by friends who stayed. I cannot promise that nothing like this will happen again. Human beings are complicated and often fallible. What I can promise, and this is the part one gift to myself and to my daughters, is that I will continue to steward a life that values clarity, dignity, and the courage to hold both gently. I will teach them to be kind, yes, but also to be precise, precise with their work, their words, their promises. That, ultimately, is the map I've been drawing since that first cracked moment. Not a perfect map, but one that helps me keep going.